Well, I have 2 o'clock. I'll officially call it Let's
Great.
Start.
Yeah.
Everybody should be able to see me and Jill. Hi, Jill.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming.
And you should also be able to see a screen that just says thank you for joining us at the virtual opening will begin shortly, which I'm going to change because we have begun. So we're just going to have, you'll be able to see the paintings hanging, and we'll be able to hear Jill's thoughts on each piece. And please use the chat feature. It should be at the bottom of your screen where you can click down there and submit a question, submit a comment. I'll be reading them. Jill can see them too. If she happens to miss any, I'll make sure that she gets to all of them, because this virtual reception is really about you getting to see the artist. And some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Jaime. I'm the gallery director here at Mark Sublette Medicine Man Gallery. Been here for about 16 years, so a long time. And I've been enjoying having Jill here the past 2 days in the gallery. We've had a lot of people come to see her show. And I'll just go and show some more beautiful shots of her paintings. And that's Jill with the gorgeous large painting. And see Canyon Lands. And then we could probably just start with Cliff Dweller. Jill, let's just start talking about each painting.
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I am thrilled to be able to have this group hang at the Medicine Man Gallery. It's a real treat to be there. This show really grew directly out of the pandemic, and I can't really talk about it without including that in the context. But when it became apparent how we were in this for the long haul, my calendar cleared of events, which is remarkably unusual, not to be teaching or doing group shows or paint outs. And I realized, I think I had a conversation with Mark kind of July, August time, saying what I really want to do is get out of the studio, and Maynard Dixon called it getting back to the real thing. And for me, the real intent behind this was to not have a preconceived idea of a show theme or, a grouping of works that all relate to each other, but to get back out there and paint from life and get back out into nature. And because of the pandemic, motels, restaurants, all off limits. So I packed up my truck and my tent and a dog and headed out into the Four Corners. I did 5 separate camping trips, all self-contained, very COVID safe, everything I needed in the truck. And the idea was just to go and wander and explore. And that's why the subtitle to the show is called A Visual Journal, because I kind of wanted to take my audience on a meander through the Four Corners. I think when we're working in the studio, we're working on, shows of larger pieces, we have an intent, we have a preconceived notion, a theme, as it were. And I just wanted to go back and get back to the real thing, as Dixon called it, and just wander around, explore new places, and paint what excited me and paint them as best as I could. So all of these paintings in the show are based on those trips and based on very small plein air studies. Because of the pandemic, a lot of the go-to places in the Four Corners, Monument Valley, Canyon de Chelly, they were closed. The Navajo Nation closed them very, very early on. And so it forced me to find new areas. And this particular piece, Cliff Dweller, was sourced from Natural Bridges National Monument, which is in Southeast Utah. I had never been there before. There's 3 stone bridges there, and you can hike. I did the full hike through the canyon floor once, and it took, I think it's like nearly 7 miles. It took a full day because it was soft sand. Cliff Dweller was at one of the bridge locations where you come in and you hike down from the canyon top. And I was down at, I believe it was Sipapu Bridge, hiked all the way down with a 40-pound backpack down these wooden staircases. And of course, stayed down in the canyon all day long. But as I was coming back up, this beautiful juniper tree offered shade. And I just realized that having spent the whole day painting in the canyon, what was really exciting me was a juniper tree fairly near the top of the canyon. He's probably, given the size of his base, I would think several hundred years old. A really, really ancient tree. And I think that appealed to me because you just think of what they have witnessed, over those years, and just a beautiful shape. So it's a square design. It's a 20 by 20. And I don't know, I just wanted to utilize the energy of the tree, capture the old bark, capture the curve energy of all those branches. He was half alive and half dead. Someone's just commented on the style, saying incompleteness. So my style is very, very loose, I would say, and I am not interested at all in rendering every detail. And maybe I should spend some time talking about my style, because for me, even as a kid, looking at Artist and Illustrator magazines where you saw the process shots of here's how I painted this painting, step 1 through to step 12, we all know when we respond. I always responded to step 7 or 8. It was before it was finished. And so here's my thinking on that. To me as a painter, what's really intriguing is how much is enough to convey the essence of a scene. How much do you need to know? But the other thing I like about pulling back from rendering every detail is that then it relies on you, the viewer, to complete the thought, right? I offer you enough evidence, enough clues, and it engages the viewer to finish off the thought process. Does that answer your question, Shirley? I think that's the best way I can explain it. And I just find that a lot more thrilling to look at than something that is rendered in full detail. It also allows me to use my expressive paint work because I'm using one brush stroke to actually indicate a lot of detail. So I hope that answers that question.
I think it does, and I actually I love the looseness and all the areas, the parts of the shadows, the movement of the tree, even the leaves. It makes me feel like there's wind. I think it's very expressive, and very excellently well done. So
I was listening to one of the things in the pandemic. Was very early on, I noticed that because of the pandemic and my anxiety about how that was going to unfold, how it was going to impact my career, how my parents were going to do back in England, and then that kind of running into the whole election scenario, there was a lot of anxiety. And I think a lot of us were glued to our phones, like we felt the need to check the news quite often. And so I realized as I was working on the body of work, the one thing I wanted to do was to get away from that and actually improve my concentration time. Mm-hmm. So I would find music in the studio that would be 2 or 3 hours long, and to try and get back to concentrating for 3 hours. And interestingly, on this same topic, I found a recording at the Royal Albert Hall in London of Yo-Yo Ma playing the cellos, the 6 cello suites, Bach's 6 cello suite. Okay. He did it from memory. It takes 2.5 hours, but he played it all from memory. And that became my go-to. I thought, if he can concentrate for that long, I can. And so it was really fun. And what's so nice is I listened to an interview with Yo-Yo Ma talking about the Bach's cello suites, exactly this same thing, but transferred to music. In that Bach was actually suggesting there was more than one cello playing. And obviously you can't do that when you just have one cello. So you have to utilize the power of suggestion. Mm-hmm. And Yo-Yo Ma was talking about how this engages the audience, because you start off with something and the audience have to finish off a painting. So
Yes.
much more
Yeah.
visually exciting, I think.
Well, when you're focused, the creativity certainly flows, and you really render the paintings beautifully. We have some questions here already. Let's see. One person asked, do you use photographs back in the studio, or do you only refer to your on-site work? Meaning,
Okay, so both. I think as you develop as a painter, you get better at using photographs. But for me, the field studies are absolutely essential, and they tend to be quite raw for me these days. I'm not intending to finish a painting. I will get what color notes I can in that time of light. Photographs don't do two things. One, they don't capture reflected light, which is really, really key in painting in the desert. And two, because they all expose on light, they tend to make the shadows very flat. And if you think of the 1 to 10 value scale, 1 being white, 10 being black, they tend to be at least 2 values too dark in a photo. So a photograph for me is telling me about form and stuff. It gives me information about form and structure and more detail if I want it, but the field study tells me the tonal range that I need to work in, and obviously the color notes. I mean, even my iPhone camera now, as technical as that is, makes everything too contrasty and too cool. So yeah, the camera, they say it doesn't lie, but actually it does quite a lot. So yeah, field studies are essential. Photographs as a backup for extra information.
Certainly. It looks like somebody else had another question back on Cliff Dweller. Do you see that question there, Jill?
Yes, the edge on the end of the juniper tree engagement. Yeah, this is fun on this one. I did have fun with where the juniper greenery meets the sky. And in fact, I think it actually shows up more in the photograph than it does on the actual painting. But yes, getting the roundness of those juniper trees to go back and into the sky is one thing, but there's also something else when the sky is that dark cobalt blue, which we get a lot in the Four Corners and in Colorado, was it sometimes does feel like a kind of cutout shape. So you want to embrace that, but at the same time, you still want to get the roundness of the form going back against it. If you look at some of Dixon's paintings, he kind of utilizes both techniques too, in that some really do look like a stencil paper cutout stuck on blue. Yes. But in this piece, you can almost see it. Actually, when I was painting the cobalt blue sky, I am using brush strokes that have the direction of the juniper tree. And to me, that created more of a visual vibration there. Yeah, which I think you kind of experience in reality. You kind of see that halo effect when you've got two such bold colors. You know, they don't hold still. You know, they are vibrating with each other. And that's what made me think it was like windy, because it had that movement, that vibration. Let's see, we have another question here. She says she's loved to see photos and sketches of the excursions you made, the dog, the tent, etc. It's all a part of the process, and yes, a lot more work to incorporate, but an interesting part of the narrative. So sometime we'll have to see if maybe you share that. Maybe that would be a fun YouTube video we could do. Yes. I think that'd be neat. If you scroll back through my Facebook pages, photographs of not so much the studies, but of the tent and the dog and the places I was camping in. I actually, you know, I have two tents. I have a 10 by 10 freestanding tent, which I took to places where it wasn't windy and it wasn't going to disappear on me during the day. And then I have a little dome tent, which is in a lot of those old photographs on my Facebook page, that fits in the back of my pickup truck. So I'm sleeping in the bed of my pickup truck. So you're up off the ground, and it's this little dome tent that sits on the side rails. So you have to take it off every day. But it was so fun at nighttime. You get a little lamp in there and it just looked like this orange globe on the back of my pickup truck. The scarier you can look in the desert, the more weird you can look, the safer you are.
And nothing compares to being out there in person painting these landscapes. And Linda says, can you describe what reflected light is?
Oh, okay. That would actually
That's
be a good question when we get to Arroyo Light later on, Linda.
Okay.
That
go to
painting
that.
is all. Do you have Arroyo Light 2020?
Yeah. I got Arroyo morning. Yeah, I'll find it here. That's a morning one.
It's the square one.
Oh, here it is. Yes.
Yes. So Linda, just to start off, essentially there are, two families of light. There's light and there's shadow. And reflected light is actually within the shadow family, but it's where it's partially lit up. So I think this is Arroyo. I mean, this is why I painted it, because of the reflected light down in there. Off of those side canyon walls where you get the really rich warms. And for an artist, it's a real trick. It's a real challenge to get your head around, because it feels like it's lit up, but it's actually still existing within the shadow. But it's where, the light from the opposite bank or from the sky or from an opposite bluff actually reflects sunlight back into that shadow. And it's in these Arroyo desert scenes, this is Vermilion Cliffs, it's often where you get those real beautiful warms within the shadow, which is another thing that breaks the art rules, because the one rule that should be deleted out of art books is, light is warm and shadow is cool. Well, the desert in Red Rock Country will flip that on its head. And it's really, really fun to play with.
Very true. And Shelley had a wonderful comment back when we were talking about quiff dollar, I believe. She said it captures the vibration of the western light, the wonderful blue against a tree. Donna asked, do you sleep in campgrounds or off the side of the road?
A little of both. I don't like sleeping by highways. I don't like hearing highway noise. So the area that I was using a lot, Vermilion Cliffs, Southeast Utah, there's a lot of BLM land. So they'll actually have what they call dispersed camping. So there's no assigned camping sites or anything, but they might have, like a compost toilet in somewhere. So Comb Ridge and Butler Wash have quite a few areas like that. So yeah, you're not in an assigned campsite. You're kind of choose your spot in the desert.
Let's see, can you tell us about Canyonland's Last Light?
So this
is a showstopper.
This was meant to be a small work show, and I called Mark up and I said, I have a small piece that really wants to be a big piece. Is that a problem? And he said, no, not at all. So this is from Canyonlands, and anyone that knows Canyonlands, the very, very far end of the highway in Canyonlands at the top, in the Island in the Sky vicinity. If you drive to the very, very far end, there's a place called Grand View Point. And this is it. And it actually overlooks the White Rim 4-wheel drive trail. And just, a beautiful scene where, the last light in the afternoon captured this. And I had a lot of fun with this and the perspective. I did have a small piece. I had this on the go at the start of the pandemic. And then I put it on a back burner because my husband had shoulder surgery in the pandemic, and I was doing his physical therapy via video from the physical therapist. She was training me by video. So I was in charge of his physical therapy at home. So it just broke the momentum. It wasn't time consuming, but it broke the momentum. So I had it on a back burner. When I figured out a small work show on the calendar with Mark, I thought, well, it would be great to have a small piece of this. And it was, redoing the small piece that kind of gave me the answers on how to finish the big piece. So sometimes things go on the back burner and they have to marinate, and then you'll be working on something else and the light bulb will come on. And oddly enough, in that foreground that's all in shadow, I was really playing with the color palette of red orange across the color wheel to blue greens, complementary colors, red orange versus blue green. I didn't want it to be orange and blue. I didn't want it to be that startling, because so much of this was about the softness of the light. So I went for a red orange blue green scheme, and this is how art works. I was actually, have you all heard of Sir Walter Sickert, the London painter? That was supposedly Jack the Ripper, or may have been Jack the Ripper.
Oh boy.
But anyway, he did a lot of kind of bordello, London theatre, bar scenes. And I was looking at his paintings, like totally different subject matter. But there he was playing this blue-green undertone off against a red-orange on top. And it's funny how you can be looking at something totally different and it switches on a light bulb for a Canyonland scene. But it really kind of retuned me into this place. This could have been a sky painting because the sky was very dramatic, but you'll see how I've really softened. If you all know the desert, you'll know that the whites, the clouds are white, can be whiter than that. And they were very striking. So I had to make a choice. Is it about the sky or is it about all those feathered canyons? And I wanted it to be about the light hitting those canyons. So I really toned down the sky to keep it soft.
Yeah, this is gorgeous. And I love the depth into it and where the sky and the land meet. It's a beautiful way they're talking to each other. Linda asks, Sir Walter who? What was the last name?
Oh,
Sir
Walter Sickert. Sickert, London painter. Yeah,
Okay.
did a lot of figures, painted Churchill. I think there's one of Churchill in the National Portrait Gallery in London by Sickert. But yeah, lots of moody, low-life London scenes.
Good. Let's see, we have another question. What is your process? Do you identify every color on the palette? I think it's what she's saying.
Oh, do I
Yeah.
pre-mix? No, I do not pre-mix. I use a pretty limited palette and I mix as I work. I don't pre-mix everything. Sometimes I might in the studio, but certainly when I'm plein air. So I have, just to go through my colors very quickly, I have cad yellow light, yellow ochre, cad orange, cad red light, cobalt blue, ultramarine blue. And I've just started to add dioxazine purple and quinacridone magenta. But essentially, you know, my initial palette was a warm and cool of each of the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. And I would call orange a yellow within that. But yeah, it's expanded slightly. But yeah, if I'm working in the field, I might just have 7 or 8 colors out there, which is not that much. So it means that, you know, I can mix as I go.
Let's see, Shirley says, your bold directional marks are so gusty and lead my eye into your work. How do you build up your strokes and do you use a palette knife?
Okay, I've never gotten used to using a palette knife, but I do use big brushes. And what I try and do, Shirley, is, you know, everyone, I know the brushwork, it makes it look easy, but it's not. And even I struggle with, you know, putting a brush stroke down and then I'll think, oh, geez, that was nice. Let me do that again, you know, and by that time you screwed it up. So it's all about reserve and really having a function for each brush stroke that you lay down. Like, think of it like each brush stroke serves a purpose. If you get into kind of tickling or noodling that paint into place and thinking, oh, I'll figure out if it feels right later, I tend to stop. You know, it's like you look out there, you try and tune into a little segment. What is that color? Mix that color, lay it down, and leave it. The laying down part is easy. The leaving it is the hard part. So
yes,
I like seeing process in a painting. Again, it gets back to what visually excites you. And I really like seeing process in the painting from that first layer to building it up.
And speaking of process, we're looking at cathedral wash. I can certainly see that. And the beautiful complementary colors of a cool blue with the orange. You want to talk about this one?
Yeah, this is Vermilion Cliffs in northern Arizona. And I spent this Arroyo Cathedral Wash, which starts in these cliffs and goes all the way down to the Colorado River. As the highway comes through the park there, you can hike up the Arroyo or down the Arroyo to the river. And the one way I like working outside is to revisit the same place, again, with no agenda. I don't like going out trying to claim paintings and, you know, think of it as a production of a product. So I just chose this Arroyo, and I probably worked in it 4 days in different directions and would just wander up and do different vistas. So this was a studio piece, but based on 4 or 5 different field studies from different places in the Arroyo. But I really like the contrast of, you know, the flatness of the very base of that Arroyo, where the water washes through fairly regularly. And then you've got all the rubble that's been stacked to one side. Well, what does that tell you about the power of nature right there? That in this dry riverbed, the water is deep enough and strong enough that when it comes through, it pushes all the rocks, you know, to one side. And then you have this next layer, you know, of the darker brown layers that have been eroded by water and all the way back to the cliffs. So it's very revealing of time passing and nature's force.
Yeah. Just there's a lot to absorb in this one. I definitely feel in the place. There's just a lot of movement. My eye keeps going all around the painting. And someone asked, she says, cathedral wash, how close are the colors to? Maybe she means to the location? I'm not sure. And the keyboards maybe seem to get cut off.
I get that a lot when people see my work and they go, was it really like that? And I'm like, well, my intent isn't to go out and do a photographic rendering of it, right? My intent is to capture my reaction to it. And anyone that knows my work, I do like color, you know, so I probably take what's there and amplify a little bit. But actually in this piece, my feeling is I actually subdued it a little bit to make it more harmonious. And a lot of people are going to disagree with me on that one. But, you know, in the gallery, you have that beautiful Josh Elliott painting in the same room. And I, with all the rocks in it. And I think that's probably sourced from the same place, actually, the same location. And he's got lots of color in too. So that's my defense. Yes.
Let's see, someone asked, do you start with a tinted ground on your canvas?
Oh, good question. If on pretty much all these pieces in the show, the answer is no, because they were smaller, okay? So when I go small, a lot of these are done on gessoed panels, because I know because of their size, I'm going to be able to work wet into wet oil paint for the entirety of that painting process. On the bigger pieces, like the Canyonlands piece we just saw, you know that's going to require a multitude of sessions over several weeks, because it's going to you're going to work on it for 3 days, then you're going to let the paint set up while you're working on other things, and then you come back to it 3 weeks later and you do another session. So on this one, I did actually do an underwash for sure. But the small paintings in this show that we're seeing sourced from the Four Corners were wet into wet on the whiteness of gesso. And I like playing off of that. That first coat of paint, of wet oil paint on gesso, the whiteness of the gesso is so strong, it comes through. And I think so many of these paintings look so luminous because they've been painted on gesso. And so they're kind of being almost lit from behind by the whiteness of the gesso ground.
I think so. And I think you'd see that with Cottonwood Shade with the beautiful deep blue. This one, when I see it in person, it takes my breath away. I just love that contrast with the blue and that yellow. And it's very luminous in person.
Right. I mean, we just get such deep blue skies. This is not far from my house. It's a place called McElmo Canyon, about an hour to the south. And just beautiful big cottonwood trees with these amazing canopies on. And I've looked to Dixon a lot in terms of painting cottonwoods, because I think if you do try and chase the detail in them, you really do lose that sense of luminosity. As soon as you start building up those paint layers, it's gone. So I really do like using white gesso underneath these full colors, because you get a nice cadmium yellow deep or cadmium yellow light, or even yellow ochre. I use yellow ochre a lot. It lights it up from behind, which is kind of what's happening to the cottonwood tree, right? Those colors get so vivid, not necessarily because of direct sunlight, but because of translucent light where the sun is coming through the leaf. That's what lights it up.
Yes, indeed. And a beautiful shadow work underneath, just the spotted little shadows. And let's see, Bobby says, do you ever select gesso board over canvas because the subject and brushwork lend itself to one or the other surface?
It's a great question, and it's one I was asking a lot, because some of these paintings I switched to canvas. So this is a very good question. Certainly for the structural arroyo scenes, right? Because gesso panel is such a hard surface. There's no weave. You've only got the texture of the gesso, and that depends how you apply it as to how much texture is there. But it's a very hard, very slick, very fast surface to work from. And fast, I mean the slickness, the brush moves fast across that surface. So certainly for the arroyo scenes where I'm doing rock and I'm trying to suggest rock, then the gesso panels were ideal. There's a softer painting of cottonwoods and mesas there, Jamie, somewhere, cottonwoods and mesas.
Oh yeah.
Where I actually started on a panel and then I tossed that to one side and got out a canvas, because I wanted it to look softer. There were more neutrals there. It wasn't so much about the structure of the trees. So I think that's a good question, because if it's less about structure and form, then I might switch to a canvas. If it is about structure and hardness and form, like rocks or a tree close up, like the Cliff Dweller juniper piece, then a panel worked really well for that.
Yes.
Great.
Shall we go to another one? Lengthening Shadows, Moab. This one's very stunning.
I camped out in Castle Valley, which is along the Colorado River, northeast of Moab, I guess, about a 30-40 minute drive out there. And just stunning. I spent a whole week there just by myself. And I think we all know that magical end of day where shadow and light start coming real close together. Like during the day, on the 1 to 10 value scale, there's a lot of contrast between light and shadow. And then as that evening comes, they really start getting close together, and the colors are just dynamite. You know, like you'll almost end up with blues and oranges, almost the same value, but not quite. And the shadows get really long. And so in this foreground, some of those super long shadows are just like a little rock, little pebble, but the sun is so low that you just see them growing and growing and growing.
How, when you're out and you have to capture this and you have the sun and you're kind of racing against the sun and those shadows are growing, I mean, how fast do you work? How long does it take you to get that down?
In this situation here, I mean, I didn't do a field study. I just sat down with my sketchbook and wrote notes, because this light effect is probably lasting no more than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
In all honesty. So, you know, and that's the thing, is like, do you set up your easel with the intent of doing 2 to 3 hours on a painting to finish it? No. You sit there, and it's almost better at that point with this situation to just observe and be quiet and just watch. And then I'll write down a whole bunch of notes, you know, and that to me is better than trying to get anything you know, down on the canvas. Other times I just get a little canvas and I'll draw something, and maybe I'll choose a little area where these big shapes intersect. And if I can get maybe 10 blobs of color you know, for all those transitions between one shape and the next, that is enough, you know. But to me, observation, I just sit and watch a lot of times. I think a lot of plein air artists are so caught up in the production of paintings and did you get a keeper and is it frameable? And actually you learn more if you just sit there and you watch.
It's amazing. Mike asked, hello, I love your work. How do you design your shadows and light? Seems no blending.
Well, I do separate them out quite distinctly because it's a very astute comment. Perfect example right there. I think I use a lot of notan theory in my work, which is spelled Notan, and it's kind of the Japanese aesthetic of balancing dark and light. It's the idea of balance and harmony. And so I really do, in my head, I separate out what's in light and what's in shadow, and I try and divide them. And I just think maybe if I exaggerate that a little bit more, it reads better as to what's in sunshine and what's in shadow. And I think a lot of the old illustrators did this and exaggerated it too. They identify what's in light, what's in shadow, where that value range is on a 1 to 10 value scale, and then they go, eek, so the contrast is a little bit more. It just makes for a more impactful design, I think. But I do use a lot of notan theory in my work. And in my sketchbooks, it's really important, the pattern and the percentage of surface area that your lights and your darks take up. So that theory for me has been immensely useful in improving the design of my paintings. And in my sketchbook a few years back, I switched to actually just using a black Sharpie pen instead of graphite pencil, because my whole point wasn't to, you know, identify and get down every tonal shift out there. It was the intent at that point was to identify a pattern of darks, because that's what your design hinges on.
Yes.
It doesn't matter. You can look at abstract art by Franz Klein, or you can look at canyon paintings by Thomas Moran, and you transfer those you can get these notan apps for your phone. If you just transfer them to a black and white, dark and light pattern, they are always thought out, planned, and that's the groundwork and the framework for any good painting, regardless of style. So.
I think that answered one of the questions, talking about the starting of your layout and your design, about the notan technique. So and then someone else asked, Linda asked, do you use big brushes? How big? What sizes?
Okay, so I use, because I'm working on oil and I like a lot of really thick paint. The brand that I use is called Grand Prix Silver, and it's a pure bristle brush, and I will pretty much use size 6 up to size 12, which is as big as they make them, which is not quite big enough for me on the bigger pieces in the studio. But I've just learned that Rosemary & Co. out of England make brushes up to bristle brushes, filberts, long filberts up to size 16. So I'm going to order some. But yeah, 8 to size 12.
Oh, and so size 12, is that like about an inch wide or something?
Yeah, it's like 1.25 inches, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I should have gotten my kid out the truck and I could have shown everyone, but yeah, about 1.25 inches. And because I like working in thick paint, okay? And so one layer is better than a multitude of layers on these smaller pieces. You want to lay it on in there, which means that you want to be able to get a lot of paint in that brush in order to make one luscious stroke. So bigger the brush, the longer the bristles, requires you to load more paint in that brush. So I tend to go for extra long filberts or extra long flats if I can get them. And that makes you load up more in the brush. And then once you lay it on, it just is beautiful. Yeah.
Yes. We have Layers of Time here, Combe Ridge. Can you tell us about this painting?
So this is this is one of the first trips actually this fall. So Southeast Utah. I think everyone's heard of Bluff because of the arts festival there. So there is a campground just west of Bluff called Sand Island, where you're right down on the San Juan River. And it just proved one of my favorite places to paint. And there's petroglyphs down there too. So you're, hanging out with 12th, 13th century artists down there. It's a magical place. Combe Ridge is a geological feature that kind of runs from there. I think it runs north-south. It's an uplift crease, as they call it. The uplift happened about 70 million years ago, I believe. And so what we're actually looking at is I'm on the underside of that. I'm painting here, and this is Combe Ridge here, and I'm underneath it. And again, beautiful reflected light. This is early morning where the sun's still behind the ridge and it's in shadow, but there's light beginning to bounce back into it. If you look at the greens within this dominantly orange violet painting, you can see the indication of the creek bed kind of way back there. And I think that gives it a sense of how high this is. But what's really magical is the rock that we're looking at that's been exposed by this uplift is 185 million years old. And, when you're going through a pandemic and you're thinking about, how you fit into history and everything, well, you go to a place like this and, realize the scale of time, and 185 million years old, and, Homo sapiens, as we know, 300,000 years on the earth. This is 185 million years. For me, there's something really comforting about that. So I found it, very meaningful to go to a place like this at this time,
That actually, that reminds me of something you mentioned in an episode of an interview that you had with Mark. It was episode 120 on Art Dealer Diaries, and I wanted to mention that today. A lot of the episode focused on biographical details, which is wonderful. But then I remember the part about knowing the landscape and being in tune with the landscape, and how you went to, I think it was the West Coast, and there were trees that you didn't recognize. And so I really love your comment. You really get to know the place you're visiting.
Yeah, no, I think when I did a lot of the plein air competitions, 2004 up to 2010, and then I pretty much quit cold turkey because, and it was so important in my growth as a painter. But then there was a point where I just wanted to paint places that I knew intimately, because, when I think about what my legacy is going to be, I don't want to be, painting around the country like a tourist. I mean, don't get me wrong, traveling and painting is a wonderful, invigorating thing to do. And often I'll go paint back in England and the light bulb turns back on for something back in Red Rock country. I mean, I think it's a necessary component, but in terms of, having a body of work that becomes, a legacy, I really wanted to spend time. I was traveling too much, and, a little cabin in Southwest Colorado was empty during the fall. And it's like that happened for 3 years in a row. And I missed the change in colors. I was like, no more, I am staying right here, So, I just landed in a very good place, a place where I wanted to paint. So.
And you have a lot of different types of landscapes close to you. You say when you drive down about an hour, you're in a canyon type wash. If you go this direction, you're in a different kind of environment.
I live at 9,000 feet up in the San Juan Mountains. So we're surrounded by blue spruce and aspen, and, 14,000 foot peaks to the north there near Telluride. And, but within an hour's drive, I'm back in sagebrush country. It drops down real fast. I love painting in Canyonlands and around Moab and Castle Valley. I can be there in 3 hours from where I live. And so, one of my favorite things out there is watching the weather, so that big Canyonlands piece, I can be at home with the truck fully loaded, ready to go for a whole week. And as soon as that weather front appears on the radar, I get out there the day before, let's get in there. So the Sand Island piece that you showed, the Combe Ridge piece,
Mhm.
I went out there and actually that area got 1.5 inches of rain in one night. And I was out there with with a dear friend, and her idea of camping is a tarp on the ground with a sleeping bag. So I thought, she's always ready to go. So I called her up and I said, Michelle, there's 1.5 inches of rain heading to the desert. Are you up for it? And she said, sure. So we went out there and we were soaking wet and frozen that night. I mean, it just poured around us. She dug a trench around her tent to drain all the water away. But I don't think
Smart.
Combe Ridge had seen 1.5 inches of rain in a long, long time. And, we had magical skies. And and this Combe Ridge is a sandy road. So you kind of have to be really careful, because even if you've got 4-wheel drive, after a rain, it can be totally impassable.
Yeah, because the land here doesn't absorb water. It doesn't sink
Right.
away very fast. It just stays there for.
And there's there's a lot of volcanic ash layers that are exposed there, and you drive through that when it's wet. It's like driving through wet concrete. You are doomed, absolutely.
Oh boy.
Doomed. But yeah, I love heading out after a weather front.
We have some good questions here. We have, do you start your painting with turpentine layers? I think she means turpentine. She says terps.
Yeah.
And quickly moved on to unthinned oil, or build up layers of thin paint.
Okay, so on the smaller pieces, Marie, I just pretty much draw in the large big shapes, and then I just go in with as close as I can to one thick layer of paint, wet into wet over 2 to 3 days. I would say that's what most of these pieces took. I may have done a smaller dummy run, just to try some ideas out, or try palette out. I don't like getting my canvas too terpy on that first drawing, washing, because then it is really hard. If painting with thick paint appeals to you, if you have that surface be slick with terps, it doesn't stick. So I like it being relatively dry. On the bigger pieces, my first layer would definitely be very much thinned down, what I call a stain layer. But then I let it set up to dry before I come back in on it. So size really does dictate technique for me. They're just different ways of working.
Interesting. Yeah, and I remember they do say fat over lean, because if you're trying to paint lean over fat, for example, the paint doesn't stick. It doesn't bind very well. So yeah. We have another question. Any advice on understanding or learning about notans?
Yes, there is a book out there by a chap called Arthur Wesley Dow, who, I think that's right. Yes, it was Arthur Wesley Dow. He's actually written a book on notan. So if you Google it or send me a direct message, and I will send you that book title. There's also another book that came out on notan, and I'm blanking on the author's names, but it's a more recent book, not a historical book. And I actually found it in the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. But again, I'm blanking on the author's title. So Mike, if you send me an email, artist@jillcarver.com, I will send you those 2 book titles. But there's a lot out there on notan, but the Arthur Wesley Dow is a classic for sure.
Wonderful. We have another question. She says, I'm curious, how did a Brit wind up in western deserts of the US? Was it always your desire to live and paint this amazing US landscape? It's a good question.
No, it was not on my list of things to do. I am from London. I've had a previous career working at the National Portrait Gallery. I met my husband at the National Portrait Gallery. He is American. He's from Colorado originally. And so we long distance dated for 4 years. And then I moved to Austin, Texas, and fell in love with the desert. First of all, out in the Big Bend, far west Texas. That's where I first started painting. And then we used to take trips to Colorado in the summer to visit his family, and I fell in love with Colorado. And it turns out an English woman doesn't do 100-degree heat very well, or cedar season in Texas. And so we ended up buying a little miner's cabin. It was a little 2-roomed miner's cabin in the town of Rico in the San Juan Mountains. And as soon as it hit 90 degrees in Texas, I would take off north with my 2 dogs, and he would come up and visit as and when he could. But we just got kind of more and more entranced by that landscape. And by living out of a city, I think I'd done 12 years in London, 12 years in Austin. In fact, I think it was 14 years in Austin by the time we fully left. And I wanted to get close to nature and back to source and live somewhere quiet. You know, I was really beginning to struggle with blocking out all the distractions and frustrations of the city. You know, waking up in the mountains beats waking up to leaf blowers in the yard next door, you know. So.
The desert's a good place for that.
Yeah.
Someone had another great question about this painting, Pinyon Pine. She says, have you ever thought about just taking a left-hand corner of Pinyon Pine picture and making it a painting?
Well, I think that's, you know, if you paint a well-designed painting, and this is fun to do actually, is you can pretty much zoom into any section and have it be an effective abstract design. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I like the juxtaposition of the pinyon pine against, you know, something soft against something hard behind in this piece. I should talk, well, and you know, what really got to me was I was camping with my dog on this piece. And when you have a dog in tow, you wander more, you just do, which is why I like taking a dog, because it makes, instead of me being in painting production mode all the time, it makes me wander. And so my favorite thing to do with my dog in the desert is find an arroyo and just keep walking and see what's there. And she would always get me up early, and we would head out. And there was something that I know everyone likes the colors of the desert and sunlight, but the violets that you get in the shadows in the arroyos during sunrise are just beautiful and luminous. But yeah, you could take this scene and come up with 4 or 5 different variations on that theme, you know, where the pinyon pine is the main feature, or just the foreground scrub be the main feature. So yeah, it's a great question. I mean, that's my problem when I'm out there, is I just see this infinite variety of possibilities. Well, there's a detail of bottom left-hand corner, Jamie. We just did.
I know, my thing just went huge.
Of the whole thing.
I'll get this back. Oh,
Oh,
I know what's happening. There we go. There we go. Now y'all know my secret. I did a PowerPoint, but didn't have it where it goes in time with each slide. This way I could see my slides and I can jump back and forth as needed. And I just hit the show feature, so it was starting to go through. All right, we're back to normal.
This is a fun piece, and I was looking at this in the gallery today because this is big, right? 36 by 60.
Yeah.
And for those of you asking about the process, you know, the thin washes to begin with, this is very, very thin and washy in places, and I love it. I was clearly having a ball doing it. But if you get some real close-up shots of this, or you're able to see it in the gallery, for those of you that's interesting, you can even see the drip trickles of my initial wash and design. And then some of it I have just left very, very thin, come back and let it dry, come back in with another thick layer of paint, rub some of that new layer off so it reveals what's underneath. So there's this blending of all kinds of different techniques and textures in this piece. Yeah, it's funny on those bigger pieces. I love the different sense that you get when you see them in person, because it is like you can walk into them. And I'm quite intrigued by that. When you photograph it and you reduce it on a screen, it just reads as a 2D image again. But I love working on the bigger pieces because they really, I think when you see them in person, they really do pull you in.
They certainly do. That creek, that deep violet, almost black creek just brings me in, and all those little detailed strokes, and then contrasted with the big bold shapes.
Yeah.
It's stunning, very stunning in person, very powerful.
Thank you.
And Valerie says, absolutely gorgeous. Textures are amazing.
Thank you, Valerie.
And Michael has a question. Jill, can you talk about the emergence of your landscape style in your experience?
Yeah, no, I've been thinking about this a lot. I think, well, one, let's face it, I respond to color. So if you say, what are you? I'm probably a colorist. But I think there's two, historically, you know, I probably fit into the post-impressionist school, which went off in numerous different directions: pointillism, cubism, fauvism, expressionism. That there's so many different languages out there, and that's how I view style. It's the language that you use to describe something. And for me, I think there's two things that have emerged or become clarified for me, if you take off the starting point of me being a colorist. And the first is the post-impressionists. If you take people like Pierre Bonnard, Edouard Vuillet, what they were doing were actually, well, let's forget this is we're trying to create 3D visual trick. Let's flatten the surface, flatten that plane, and just deal with shapes and patterns of flattened color. And if we get those right and interesting, it will still read. And if you look at that period of work, that's what they were doing. I definitely see or speak that way, but then I'm also speaking the language of expressionist brushstrokes, which for me help emphasize structural forces of form or nature, you know, in those washes, and energy and rhythm. So I think I've got those two things, flattening everything into flat shapes of color, and then expressive brushwork indicating form or directional energy. For me, I think I am a blending of those two languages. And it may be that as I evolve, one of those will win out. But I think right now, what's happening is those two are blending in my work. Does that make sense, Michael?
Makes sense to me. That's a beautiful way to put it. Style, language. That's what it's about.
And certainly, you know, when I think about the British artists, you know, I like the ones that flatten it. You know, Vanessa Bell was great at that. But then I like also the expressive brushwork. Oh, Ivan Hitchens would be another British person that did that. You know, he'd take a 3D scene and just flatten it and just create this pattern of flat shapes of color and say, well, let's not play around here. We're not trying to create 3D on 2D. Why don't we just do 2D on 2D? That's what we're producing. And then I really like, you know, the British artists like David Bomberg, you know, between the world wars, used a very expressive brushwork and a lot of color. So I think it's a blending of those two languages right now.
And then someone has another question, Donna. She asked, what things are helpful to make things look like they are lit by the sun?
Yeah, so we think of the sun as warm light, which it is, okay? So Donna, in a way, the best way you can indicate sunshine is actually by getting your shadows right. I mean, that ultimately is the trick here, because if you nail the sunlight color note correctly, but your shadows are off, that's gonna upset everything. So, and the other thing for me is when you're in a situation like this, like in Arroyo, the sun is shining, clear skies, remember that you have two sources of light. One is the sun, which when it's direct is a warm source of light. And the other is the blue sky, and people often forget that, okay? And actually that blue sky is obviously, because it's blue, is a cool source of light. So the interplay between those two sources of light and being able to, if you take a rock and just put it outside on your patio and see which plane is hit directly by the sun, and then what happens is that rock turns over and that top plane is actually more influenced by the blue of the sky than by the direct light of the sun. So I think identifying the two light sources and figuring out what is the most dominant one for the situation that you're working at is really key. And then getting the value of the shadow right. Sometimes I see when I'm judging shows and things, I see shadows go too blue, too purple. And particularly in the desert, there's so much reflected light in them that they're actually, you know, they can be quite warm.
Great answer.
It's like a mini workshop going on here. It's great.
I love it. I love that we're getting very technical. It's awesome. Because I remember in your episode, your interview with Mark about how much knowledge you have about the painting. You've done artist retreats for like a year and things like that you've done.
Yeah, no, I spent a long time. When I worked at the National Portrait Gallery, you know, I was always painting. I was going to life drawing a couple of times a week and always painting and going out with my tent and painting on the weekends. And then once I'd done 10 years at the National Portrait Gallery, I qualified for a sabbatical, which meant I wouldn't be paid, but they would secure my job. And I was really intrigued. You know, my artwork at that point, you kind of reach a tipping point where you have to test yourself. Do I need to make the jump to it or not? And so I took a sabbatical and went to New Zealand and lived in a van for 4 months and just painted every day and had my first exhibition at New Zealand House in London. But that was my first time of doing it day in, day out. And I realized it wasn't going to be easy. It was going to be an emotional roller coaster.
I'm just flipping through some more paintings. That one's very dreamy.
Yeah, gorgeous. This is the little, I think, you know, in my head, this little piece is probably going to be the starting point for the next group of work, which I'm intrigued by the bigger pieces and being able to layer the paint over multiple sessions. I think it's very conducive to a moving sky. I want to get that sense of movement. And I love the abstractness of these scenes where, again, how much is enough to indicate what it is back out there, but to leave enough mystery to really draw the viewer in to that little journey. I mean, I feel like this needs to be a big painting. It's only a little 8x10, but this is looking across the Canyonlands from Dead Horse Point, which again, I made the run out there after a weather front came through, and it was just incredible. And again, could you set up and paint this? I have a zillion photographs of this morning unfolding, and you'd be silly if you tried to set up your easel and paint. You would miss so much, you know? So it's just a case of, I was sitting there with one of the park rangers because she'd never seen a morning that stunning either. And we just sat and watched this, you know, magical dance of these clouds rising from the canyon floor and then, you know, hitting different air pressures and kind of those clouds capping out and being forced back down. I mean, it was just magical watching it unfold.
Amazing. Liz asks, do you consciously choose the chief temperature for each painting, or are you more influenced by the time of day?
Yeah, I don't. I know a lot of artists think about temperature when they're painting. They'll have a warm side of a painting, a cool side of a painting. And I don't think that way. And I just think it just comes back to style, you know, and what you might think of. I definitely think in terms of big shapes of color and not so much in terms of temperature.
Mm-hmm. And then Chula asks, with all these beautiful little studies, how do you manage to let them go? How do you decide which studies you need to keep for future studio pieces?
Well, I met some collectors today in the gallery that had bought previous paintings of mine. And it was so nice to meet them because some of these are very difficult to let go. And it's like letting your children out into the world, you know? And I get very attached to them, and they may feel like a real keystone piece, you know, in my development, and I'd love to maybe hang on to them, but you know, I have to make a living and let them go. So it was really nice to meet them, because to me they've got one of my children and they're the foster parents. So it's like, oh great, now I can check in on you, you know, how's it doing? So
Any other painting you want to make comments on? I flipped through a few of them, as you've seen. September's song is very stunning.
this is Mark and Kathleen Sublette visited me in my studio. I think it was September or October last year, and this had come back from a show at the Hockaday Museum in Kalispell, Montana, and I just had it sitting around in the studio, and Mark came in and just, you can have it, Mark. You know, so, yeah. So this is a painting done from a Plein Air Painters of America paint out up in Glacier National Park. And we were there in the fall, and it was cold and it was so windy, so windy. So all of us got these little scruffy raw filled studies. But this is a spot, I love going back to a spot, you know, a few days in a row. For the artists out there, you'll see how I really wanted it to be a blue-orange complementary color scheme. And if you look, I really pushed any greens towards an orange green. And I do that a lot to make sure you don't want to add in too many, you know, disconnected hues. And actually the Pinyon Pine and Fisher Mesa painting, if we can go back to that for a second, there was every color of the rainbow in that situation. And I just knew it was going to be screamingly too loud. So for the sky in this, it looks blue, folks, doesn't it? But it's actually made up of green and violet. And so because I had so much green and violet in the rest of the painting, it sits right in there. If I'd actually gone for a blue hue like ultramarine, it would have felt like an alien hue that was somehow disconnected, non-harmonious, and it would have set up a real jarring effect just because there's so much color elsewhere. So that sky is actually made from phthalo green and dioxazine purple mixed together. And in some places it's more the green, and in some places it's more the violet, and it just tricks the eye to think of it as blue. You can get real close to blue with green and purple. Who would have thought? But you can.
That's amazing. I'm actually really surprised. That's very interesting. Mike asks, coming from England, how do you adjust to painting the Southwest?
Oh my gosh, Mike, it was a steep learning curve. So in England, my palette consisted largely of earth tones and things that I saw out there. So I had Payne's Gray, I had sap greens, I had yellow ochres, burnt umbers, you know, things that you saw in England quite a lot. And I moved to Texas and none of it worked, obviously. And so Texas was a big learning curve for me, and it did me the world of good, because failure is a part of what we do. It's part of the process. And I failed so much that I knew I had to take the time and go back to basics and start over again with just 3 colors, red, blue, and yellow. And that's what I did for 2 years down there. And I learned color mixing from the primaries all over again. It was like going back, you know, to school and being humbled, but it was a necessary part of the process for me. And let me tell you, if you've never just worked, so my 3 were cad red light, ultramarine blue, and cad yellow light. And I worked with those for just 2 years, and I learned so much by doing that. I think too many people jump in with too many colors initially, and it took me a while to get used to it, but I just learned so much from that. And a lot of it comes down to mixing dexterity. It doesn't take much cad red light to shift things hugely. And it's a really important part of the process. And I think a lot of people try and fast track by it, and they don't understand color and how color works, or how color harmonizes, or how color vibrates, because they've skipped that step. So
That's,
yeah.
that's really interesting. All of those, you know, cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and ultramarine blue, you said, they're all warm colors, because from what I know, ultramarine blue is a warmer blue. And it's amazing, you know, to push any like cool areas in your painting. What kind of challenges did you have when you just had those three colors?
Well, you know, in that sense, the white is the danger color. The white, adding white to anything will cool it off.
That's true.
So that's, you know, you add white to ultramarine blue, you'll get a very cool blue. So yeah, you're right, Jamie, in that when I switched to my warm and cool of each primary, then most of those first ones would be considered my warm for sure, because cobalt would be cool.
Yeah.
I guess the real debate is with the cad yellows and cad oranges. And some of those books out there actually say, well, yellow is the warmest color on the color wheel. Well, actually, I think truly it's a yellow orange that is the warmest, you know, so that might flip the theory. Your cad orange might be your warm. And certainly if you had a cad lemon, then a cad lemon is a cool, you know, so yeah.
I was just about to say lemon yellow.
Yeah, but generally speaking, you know, the white is what cools things off. And that's often what gets people into trouble with the primary palette. Certainly when I switched to using that, because you're using so much white to lighten, because you don't have too many options. You know, the yellow will lighten, obviously. Blue's very dark, ultramarine's very dark. It tends to go all cool and very chalky. Yeah. And that's a lesson in itself, because then you start learning to use yellows to lighten, as opposed to reaching for the white every time. Sometimes yellow is enough to lighten it, particularly if it's a subtle shift in the middle value area. Yellow is enough, and it keeps it nice and warm.
And the white you use, is it titanium white? Or because there's different types, like sometimes there's zinc white.
I use a Gamblin white blend, which is a blend of titanium and zinc from Gamblin. And I really like the consistency. That's one of the deciding factors too, is yes, it's a very nice balance between what titanium does and what zinc does in terms of opacity, but the consistency as it comes out the tube, it's ready to go. I'm not having to, some whites are just very stiff and you have to work them quite hard, you know.
Interesting. Cheryl asked, when you go back to a spot several days in a row, are you working on the same piece, or are you starting new paintings each time?
I start a new piece each time. And again, I'm not looking to complete a painting. I'm looking to be a student of nature and just see what I can get in an hour and a half. I really don't go beyond that, because the light has changed. So I shoot for an hour and a half, and they tend to be very raw and like mosaic-like studies where I'm just grabbing color notes from different shapes. And my fun thing is to just go without any self-consciousness of what I'm producing, but go to the same place, new little canvas each day. And then what's fun is at the end of the painting trip is you pull them all out and you look at them together. And that's really fun, because what you're actually doing when you're outside painting is actually learning to see. And if you end up in the same place for 3 consecutive mornings, let's say, you will see come the third study that you're just seeing so much more. You're seeing more nuance, you know, you're learning that place, you're beginning to understand how it's working. That's really fun to see.
I love that you said painting is teaching you how to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's true.
When I look at my superiors, you know, if I look at the work of Len Schmiel or George Carlson, you know, technically I know they're so much more proficient. Well, you know, I've still got a little time, but what my initial reaction is, oh, they see so much more than I do. You know, Len did this series of looking through water and painting the little stream bottom with the rocks, and then the water on the top, and then the reflected sky on that. And even little bubbles traveling on the surface of the water, he realized cast a little bubble-like shadow on the river bottom. I was just looking at those and I was just like, oh my gosh, he sees all of that. You know, that's what I'm jealous of, is how much they see.
We have more wonderful questions. Kay asks, how surprising has your life been? When did you know painting was your dream?
That's a great question, Kay. My life has been very surprising. I didn't think I would end up in the States. I really didn't think I, could be a professional artist. It's certainly a dream to be in the Medicine Man Gallery. It's a gallery I've adored and looked up to since I came to the States. And my first trip to Tucson must have been 12 years ago, probably, to come to the gallery in the Old Town location. So I've been very, very fortunate. I'm very aware of that. And I've had a husband that's been very supportive and just as thrilled. When I moved to the States, I had every intention or assumption that I would continue the research curatorial work that I'd done in London. And I think that was both my husband's and mine's just assumption, was I would carry on in that role. Well, it turns out that there's not much demand for knowledge of 18th century British portraiture in the middle of Texas. So, after a year, I was just reeling. I was ready to get on a plane and go home because I was so lost, And my husband said to me, well, maybe painting should become your profession. And he said, I'll support you for 3 years and then let's see where we are, So I made that jump and I literally started from the ground up. I took some workshops, I studied, I went back to the primary color palette. I worked really hard. I had a daily routine. And I started off doing the street fairs with the 10 by 10 tent and the panels, and doing the Austin Fine Arts Fair every year. And I did just fine, with that. It was a really good way of getting off the ground. I still have collectors from those days still following me. But yeah, I started off doing the street art fairs, work my way up from the bottom.
Right on. Let's see. How hard was it to learn to paint where seeing the painting from afar and then up close so different?
Oh, I don't think, Kay, that it was my intention for that to happen. So I think Kay is referring to this reaction to my work where if you're close to it, it feels very abstracted and broken apart. And then if you view it across the room, it actually feels like quite realistic. And there's that, I think that's how people, they see it from afar and they think, oh, I know what that is. And then they get up close to it and realize how loose and abstracted it is. I guess from what I've been saying, that is an aesthetic choice. It is kind of what excites me. But at the same time, I was talking to a chap in the gallery today, you don't really choose how it comes out. It just comes out that way. I would love to get up and paint like Walt Gonski, on certain days. And it just, as hard as I try, it doesn't come out that way. So, it could be anybody. I'd like, maybe it's another artist another day. I think we all look at these other artists, but at some point, because of your own personal aesthetic sensibilities, and then because of your, we all have different strengths with the way that we draw and how we draw or how we identify something. There's a zillion different choices that happen as you're painting, and that's what defines style. It's not something that you choose, it has everything to do with how you think and those choices that you make. Is this going to be a hard edge? Is it going to be a soft edge? Am I going to blend it with a dry brush? Am I going to make them transition with a third color note? All of those are choices that define style.
Well, we have a few more questions. We are going to be wrapping it up. I just want to announce that. That way people, if you have any more comments or questions, go ahead and put them in now. We do have some more questions we're going to get through, but I just wanted to let you know. Liz asked, I think back when we were talking about the shapes and the color hue, she says, so getting your values of major shapes frees you up to choose color hue?
Oh, yeah, this is a great question, Liz. So that the short answer would be yes. Okay, but let me expand on that a little bit. And I'm actually gonna produce, for the artists watching, I'm gonna be doing an instructional DVD later this year. We're gonna be filming it. And part of that is I'm gonna be explaining my understanding of color, right? So any color has three ingredients: hue, value, and chroma. So hue is what color family it belongs to. Is it blue? Is it green? Is it a violet? Value is the tonal range. Is it dark? Is it light? And then chroma is how intense, how saturated, or how grayed off and neutralized is that color. So three ingredients. I've got a mathematician's brain. So I think of that as the X, Y, and Z coordinate, identifying where that color is within a color sphere. Okay. Once you've got your head around that, you then have three things that you can play with. And one of the tools that I go back to constantly is, once you've identified, maybe your big shape has in reality 10 value shifts. Well, what if you just chose one or two? And then within those one or two, depending how many you felt you need, you shift hue rather than value. And portrait artists use this a lot to get the plane of the face to shift and change back. So maybe as it's going away from a light source, you might think, well, I can handle that plane change by downshifting and dropping down a value. Or maybe I can just change it by shifting hue and going for a cooler hue, but of the same value. And you can start playing with those three ingredients by holding one static and moving the other two. Does that make sense, Liz? Hope so.
It made sense to me. You could probably also shift the intensity too, like you said. I think the chroma.
Absolutely, yeah.
Less saturated as far in the distance, things are kind of cloudy and fuzzy and light. And up close, they're much more intense.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lots, and again, all those choices come down to essentially, ultimately defining your style. You know, there's numerous paths that you can choose. I think that's the fun part of this.
And we have another question. How much redesign of Mother Nature do you do to create a better design? Simplification, rearranging elements, etc.?
So I was talking to Mark. Maybe we could go back to the square Arroyo light.
Yes.
Where we talked about reflected light. Because I was talking to Mark Sublette about this yesterday or this morning in the gallery, and talking about what I had shifted. And it's pretty much the scene as it exists. Like, I didn't edit out trees or anything like that, but it's a square, and I use a underlying kind of diagonal armature quite a lot on the square format paintings. And so a lot of these key points, for instance, top left-hand corner, that little mesa point there is right on a diagonal. As you come down, there are certain points on that canyon wall that lie on a diagonal or lie on a line that's paralleling the diagonal. The mountains in the background are the Echo Mountains. And in reality, if you were just to take a snapshot of this scene, they would probably height-wise take up a third of that canvas. So I really kind of changed perspective, because again, you come back to the idea of what's the motif, and the motif was the reflected light. I wanted you to look down in that arroyo and then take that journey. The mountains were secondary. So my first study in the studio, I shrunk them a little bit. And then my second study, I realized that I could really shrink the height and push them way back. So it adds greater depth to the painting. But yeah, if you'd actually seen that in the flesh, they take up a lot more. So little nuance shifts according to whatever design I think is best. And then certain things like this came to mind because I really struggled with getting enough confidence to reduce them that much and push them way back.
Amazing. Well, let's see, we could probably wrap it up. I see people making wonderful comments about this being a very wonderful information-filled talk, and I have to say, yes, you're amazing, Jill.
Oh, thank you, Amy. You're amazing too. I love you and love Mark and Kathleen, and I just feel so honored to be in the gallery. And I normally get so nervous around openings, and I was saying to a friend today that I don't think I've enjoyed an opening week quite so much. You just make it so easy.
Oh, good.
And it's just been wonderful getting to know everybody.
Yes. Yeah, I appreciate all the clients that come in. Everybody's really wonderful. So everybody's really easy to talk to.
Yeah.
And it's nice that we had this where you came in a few days a week, and then this online reception. It has been really
it's
nice,
really borne out the pleasure of the event rather than just a 2-hour kind of full on. I should explain to everybody, we had this debate about whether I would be in the gallery with Jaime doing this on Zoom, but we decided that if we were to do that, then we really would have to keep our masks on. And I think it's actually really nice seeing Jaime's beautiful smile and not having my face totally covered up by a white mask. So yeah, we decided this is my little casita rental that's 2 miles down the road from the gallery. So
yes, yeah, this was a nice setup. Very nice. And I appreciate, I'm seeing all the thank yous that are coming through the chat. And someone from Ireland has joined us. That's wonderful.
What time is it in Ireland? They must be well into cocktail hour by now, I would think. 7 hours ahead. So yeah, it's great.
Well, I think, she says 10:20 p.m. where she's at.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap it up, and I think we covered a lot, and everybody's saying thank you. And Shelley asked, will this be posted? Yes. Oh, I wanted to mention, I did see a lot of people coming in late and some people coming and going, probably having technical problems. It will be posted. We will have to, process the video, but these go on YouTube, and we've had 2 other artist receptions before that haven't been posted yet. So Jill will be in line. If you want a preview, once it gets up on YouTube, we can always send you a link even before it gets posted live, because there's the unlisted link that lingers there for a while until Patrick and Mark post it. So we will have this recording, so that's wonderful.
And the podcast that I did with Mark some time back was episode 120, I think.
That's right.
If anyone is intrigued, Mark really followed my, biographical kind of story. So anyone that's, more intrigued with that and my background, I think Mark went into great depths. It ended up being 1 hour and 45 minutes long. So open a bottle of wine and sit down.
Yes. That was a wonderful episode 120. Just type in Jill Carver, you'll find it. So, well, I think we covered everything. I really appreciate everybody joining and asking fantastic questions. I couldn't have.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. Great. It made it a lot easier for us.
Yes.
All that input for sure. So yeah, thank you for everybody asking questions.
All right. Well, we'll call it a day, and thank you, Jill. And thank you to everybody who joined.
Yeah. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Good evening. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.